This is the 5-minute guide to the Tsesarevich, a pre-dreadnought battleship of the Imperial Russian Navy.
The origins of this particular ship are tied up in the imperial ambitions of Russia, and in particular Tsar Nicholas II. You see, Russia has a bit of a problem when it comes to ports for its navy. They're either in areas where you have to pass through a very narrow strait controlled by foreign powers to get anywhere, like the Baltic or the Black Sea, or else they're so far north they spend a significant portion of the year either locked up in ice or surrounded by ice. Neither of these things are especially useful if you want to maintain a strong navy that's actually taken seriously. With all the good bits of Africa carved up amongst the various European powers already, focus was starting to shift towards the Western Pacific at the end of the 19th century, with both European and Japanese interests in expanding territory. In the 1890s, the Sino-Japanese War ended in Japan's favour, and it took the Liaotung Peninsula as part of the spoils. This effectively blocked any Russian territorial ambitions immediately south of its borders, so Russia enlisted France and Germany to collectively force Japan to return the territory to the much easier to bully China in exchange for a ton of cash. Almost immediately, Russia then signed a very convenient lease on Port Arthur, the main warm water port on the said peninsula. It thought itself very clever for this, only the Japanese were a little ticked off about the whole affair, and promptly spent most of the massive cash payment they'd received on expanding their navy. The Russians were now faced with the need to rapidly reinforce their Pacific fleet, otherwise the now much more powerful Japanese fleet might just take the place back anyway. But all Russia's shipyards were at full capacity. Enter the French. They proposed a ship based on the French battleship that. And with a few minor changes, the ship was ordered in 1898. As with other French ships of the time, the Tsesarevich would have a tumble-home hull, where the hull got much narrower as it went from the waterline to the main deck. The reduced weight meant that the main deck could be higher and the guns had better fields of fire, but as a number of Russian ships were to discover later on, it heavily compromised the ship's buoyancy and stability. So you had a ship that could shoot really well, but was somewhat questionable in the fields of staying upright and afloat, which are genuinely considered important in ships. With an average pre-dreadnought speed of 18 knots, the ship carried 4 12-inch guns in a pair of twin turrets in the usual pre-dreadnought layout of 1 forward and 1 aft, with a relatively slow rate of fire of just over 1 round every 2 minutes. In a somewhat forward-thinking installation, the 12 6-inch guns of the secondary battery were mounted in 6 twin turrets, with a tertiary battery of 20 75mm guns mounted in the hull and on the superstructure. But this wasn't enough firepower, so a further 20 47mm guns and 8 37mm guns were also scattered about the ship's upper works, alongside 4 lightweight torpedo tubes, one in each direction. And if that wasn't enough, there were also 45 mines to allow the ship to protect its own anchorage. One wonders if some poor American ship designer from World War II hadn't been thrown back in time to 19th century France, as you could barely take a step on this ship without running into a gun or some other explosive device. A 9.8-inch main belt would protect the ship's vitals, and the ship was built remarkably quickly for a French yard, laid down in 1899 and launched about a year and a half later. She was in service at Port Arthur by the end of 1903, the most powerful battleship the Russians actually possessed. Just in time for the Japanese to decide they'd had enough Russian meddling and they were going to war. Remember all the money they'd spent on their fleet instead of getting Port Arthur? Well, that fleet was, you guessed it, now coming for Port Arthur. The Russians weren't stupid and began to moor in the outer harbour to be able to more quickly react in the event of a troop landing. Unfortunately, this played right into Japanese hands, and a surprise torpedo attack opened the war. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody? 3 ships were struck by torpedoes, including Tsesarevich, knocking her out of action for 4 months. During this time, a number of the lighter guns were removed to reinforce the port's defences. In August 1904, the Russian Pacific forces in Port Arthur attempted to break the Japanese blockade and reach Vladivostok. Tsesarevich led 5 other battleships, 4 protected cruisers and 8 destroyers against 4 battleships, 2 armoured cruisers and 7 protected cruisers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Both Tsesarevich and the battleship Pobeda had engine issues that slowed them down, and the 2 fleets met just after lunch at the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Neither side inflicted much damage on the other, and with evening coming it looked like the Russians would escape. Then a pair of 12-inch shells from Asahi struck the conning tower, fragments bouncing off the overhanging roof to kill 4 men inside, one of whom was the Russian Admiral Wittgeft, and the other being the helmsman. This caused the ship to veer out of line, with a number of other battleships playing follow the leader, not realizing what had happened. The Retvidzan then charged the Japanese fleet to buy time, succeeding quite dramatically, with the Russian fleet able to reorganize and Retvidzan itself actually surviving. However, the bulk of the fleet was forced to return to Port Arthur, whilst the damaged Tsesarevich was forced to head to the German port of Tsingtao, where it was interned. The whole operation had fallen apart with those two critical shell hits. After the war, the ship was transferred to the Baltic, where it helped suppress a rebellion and began a process of losing the 75mm guns. She didn't do all that much during the First World War before joining a general mutiny in 1917 and being renamed Grazdanin, whereupon she and the pre-dreadnought Slava fought a battle with about half the High Seas Fleet, with the Germans actually taking more damage overall despite winning the field. After this, she would be hulked in 1918 and scrapped in 1924, it not being considered worth it to repair the damage suffered in that battle.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.